According to the Bible, humanity is 6,000 years old, right? I mean, maybe. It's possible. The Bible doesn't actually say 6,000 years, but there is a way of reading it that gets you there. Millions of Christians read it that way for sure. For a long time, that's the only way that I read it too. But here's the thing. Counting years isn't the only way to measure history. There's another way to look at it, and when you see it in a different light, 6,000 years starts to look like using grade school math to answer a theological question. That simple math is based on biblical genealogies, a fancy word for a family tree. Most people think of genealogies as the boring parts of the Bible. They get skipped or skimmed or glossed over on the way to something more interesting in the rest of the story, which is understandable. They're mostly just names and ages. And it's those ages that get counted up to calculate the age of humanity and really the age of creation itself. But here's what doesn't get taught in Sunday school. No two genealogies in the Bible are doing the same job. And I don't mean that the names are different. I mean that the purpose is different. Some of them aren't even tracking birth order at all. They're tracking nations, or they're tracking covenants, or claims to a throne. And the ages inside of them aren't always telling the story that we assume they're telling either. They're stranger and a lot more intentional than a simple lifespan. Before I get in too deeply into this, I want to say thank you. This channel just crossed 100,000 subscribers a few days ago, and I think that that is a lot of black sheep. I started this YouTube thing because I wanted to help people go deeper in Scripture without needing a seminary degree to do it. And watching the community grow like this is way more than what I'd hoped it would be. So genuinely, thank you for being a part of this. And if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed, my question for you is, what are you waiting for? There's a subscribe button right on this page. You can click it right now. All right, back to the story. Here's my promise to you for this video. By the end of this video, you're going to see genealogies in the Bible as doing a lot more and being a lot more interesting than you ever have before. And second, you're going to learn something about the earliest genealogies, the ones stretching back before Noah's flood, that might just change how you see human history, humanity itself, or even the way that time works. But before all of that, let's start where everybody else starts. Let's just do some simple math. Quick intro about myself. I'm Scott. I'm a pastor. I'm a Bible teacher in Florida. I've got a degree in theology and a master's in biblical studies. And I only mention that to let you know that I'm not a random guy with a camera and a wild idea. Although I kind of started that way. My goal with this channel is to make the depths of biblical scholarship more accessible for every person. Think of me like your scuba instructor. I'm helping you go deeper without drowning in big words and complex arguments. Dr. Michael Heiser said it this way. He called it the middle earth, like bridging the gap between Sunday school and seminary. That's what I hope for this to be. That's why I'm approaching this topic this way today. This topic can get pretty heated. People have strong feelings about this stuff. So I'd rather take my time and explain my reasoning very slowly rather than just tell you my conclusions about it. Okay, one more aside I wanted to throw in here. I was editing this and I realized I'm missing some context. Genealogies aren't the only tool that people use for landing on 6,000 years of creation in human history. If you've read deeply into this topic yourself, you might already know that there are some other pieces that people bring into the calculation. For example, some will point to the regnal years of the kings of Israel and Judah. These are cross-checked against outside records. There are arguments built from 2 Peter where it says that a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, suggesting that history runs on a 6,000-year week before a final Sabbath rest. I really like that interpretation personally. Even sabbatical and jubilee cycles from the law get folded in sometimes, although those are also becoming a little less reliable as we get past the 6,000-year mark, since the Sabbath rest and jubilee cycles are also pointing to an eschatological conclusion. Some of them fall apart if we go much further past the current timeline. I don't think any of those are wasted effort. Some of them, especially the regnal years, rest on really firm historical ground, and probably even more firm than what you might find earlier than Abraham in the timeline. But notice what they actually do also. None of them are standing on their own. They're all still reliant on the same genealogies that we're talking about today. The regnal years only take you back to Abraham. So anything earlier than that leans entirely on Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. So if those genealogies aren't doing what we've always assumed they're doing, then the whole structure resting on top of it needs a second look as well. So let's look at the math like I said that I would do. The math that's been used for centuries to land at 6,000 years as the age of humanity. Here's what people don't realize, I think. That 6,000 years number isn't stated plainly in the Bible. There's no date written 6,000 years since Adam. It's built from counting and combining ages of people mentioned in different genealogies. Not just one long genealogy, several of them, stacked end to end like train cars. You've got Genesis 5, tracking Adam down to Noah, then Genesis 11, tracking Noah down to Abraham. Those family trees take place in the pretty distant past without much corroborating history in the biblical text itself. And then from Abraham forward, from Genesis 12 forward, we're using dates that historians are fairly confident about, the dates that are tied to kings and empires that we have outside records for. Chain all of these together, and you land on a number right around 6,000 years, or at least from today, from here. So before we even get to whether the ages themselves mean what we think they mean, I want you to notice this. The whole calculation depends on treating separate genealogies, written at different times about different subjects at different parts of the biblical story, as if they're all one continuous, unbroken chain, end to end, with nothing missing. That's a pretty big assumption that a lot of us have never really questioned. Let's look more closely at two of the genealogies doing the heaviest lifting. That's Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. Genesis 5 gives you a pattern that repeats 10 times. So-and-so lived this many years and fathered so-and-so, and then he lived this many more years, and then he died. It happens over and over in Genesis 5. Genesis 11 does something almost identical from Noah to Abraham. And so you add those two lists together, and you already land somewhere around 2,000 years before Abraham's story even starts. James Ussher made this famous in the 1600s. Rather than being a fringe figure working with angel numbers and secret numerology, he was a serious scholar who did diligent work using the tools available to him at the time. He calculated creation at 4004 BC, and that number got printed in the margins of Bibles for centuries since then. It became so common that people started treating it as if it was part of the scripture itself. By the way, a lot of what we believe is from what we've been taught about the Bible, not from the Bible itself. A lot of it doesn't show up in the Bible itself at all. That's why Bible teachers are held to high standards and accountability by God, and why you should be very cautious about who you listen to. Even when you're listening to me, I'm not infallible. Test things yourself. Be a Berean, like in Acts 17, a Berean. All right, I just needed to say that real quick and get it out of the way. But back to the math here. Here's the problem. The deeper you go into the ancient history, the harder that number is to hold on to. Egyptian records, Mesopotamian records, ice cores, and tree rings and layered sediment, all of it stretches back further than 6,000 years. And it stretches back consistently from multiple unrelated methods that all roughly agree with each other. For some folks, that discrepancy has shaken their faith. They would ask, how can the Bible say humanity is 6,000 years old when archaeologists find human bones that are tens or hundreds of thousands of years old? For others, it's hardened them into a mindset that's unwilling to hear anything that contradicts their understanding of Scripture. For a long time, the only answer most Christians gave was that all of it has to be wrong. Every dating method, every civilization's own records of itself was wrong. But honestly, I think a lot of us have secretly stopped finding that answer to be satisfying. It's hard to say that all of science is a big fat lie. So slow down with me for a second. Before we throw out the evidence or throw out the Bible, let's actually go look at what these genealogies are doing. Because my hunch is that no one ever taught you that this added up method isn't the only way Scripture handles a family tree. So, if genealogies are the backbone of this 6,000-year number, we need to actually understand what a genealogy in the Bible is for. And here's the first thing that surprised me when I actually studied this out more closely. Not every genealogy in Scripture is trying to do the same job. Take Genesis 10, for example. This is the famous Table of Nations right after the flood. On the surface, it reads like Genesis 5, a normal genealogy. You have names and descendants and family lines. But if you look closer, you'll notice something's missing. There are no ages at all. Nobody's lifespan is mentioned. Nobody dies at the end of their entry. Instead, you get nations. Egypt and Canaan and Cush and the Philistines, entire peoples listed as if they were individual sons in a family tree. That's because Genesis 10 isn't tracking biological descent at all, or at least not the way that we think of a family tree today. It's mapping the nations of the ancient world, showing how all of these people relate to one another and ultimately reach back to Noah himself. It's part genealogy, part political geography, part theological statement about the unity of the human race, and most historians call this kind of list a genealogy anyway. Not because it's formatted the same way as Genesis 5, but because it uses the same family language of fathers and sons. But it's doing something different than just counting years. So, right there in Scripture, you've got two genealogies actually sitting one chapter apart. There's Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, and Genesis 11, the lineage from Noah through Shem down to Abraham, but they're not doing the same job. Genesis 11 is tracking a covenant line down to Abraham from Noah. Genesis 10 is mapping out nations after the flood. It's the same literary form, a genealogy, but a different purpose entirely. Now go back a few chapters to Genesis 4, and you'll find a third genealogy that looks different again. This one follows Cain's line. Cain has a son named Enoch, and Enoch has a son, and so on down through Lamech. But notice what this genealogy is tracking. It's not ages, it's culture and the first glimpses of civilization. Lamech's sons are named as the father of those who dwell in tents and raise livestock, the father of those who play the harp and the flute, or the forger of bronze and iron tools. This genealogy is tracking human achievement and the development of civilization, not years lived. Then flip one chapter over, Genesis 5, and you get Seth's line instead of Cain's line. Same time period, roughly the same generations, but this genealogy looks completely different. Every single entry follows the exact same formula. So-and-so lived this many years and fathered so-and-so, then he lived this many more years, had other sons and daughters, and then he died. Over and over, 10 times, 10 generations from Adam to Noah. It reads almost like a liturgy or a rhythm. Ages and ancestry are the whole point here in a way that they weren't for Cain's line just one chapter before. So even within Genesis itself, in the span of a few chapters, you've got one genealogy tracking cultural development with no ages given, another genealogy right next to it built entirely around ages itself, then one tracking nations, and finally one tracking covenantal connection. You've got 4 genealogies, 4 seemingly different purposes. That's the author making a choice about what each list is for. Remember, it's all the same author. And this pattern isn't limited to Genesis. Look later in Scripture at how genealogies get retold. First Chronicles opens with pages of genealogies, and a lot of them cover the exact same people you find in Samuel and Kings. But Chronicles is selective in a very specific way. It's obsessed with the priestly line, the Levites, and the temple. Samuel and Kings, telling the same history, are obsessed with the monarchy instead, who sat on the throne and when. Same families, same generations, 2 different genealogical emphases, because the author of the Chronicles is making an argument about worship and the temple that Samuel and Kings simply weren't trying to make. And before you think this is just an Old Testament habit, you see the exact same thing happen with Jesus in the New Testament. Matthew opens his gospel with a genealogy running from Abraham down to Jesus. Luke has one too, running from Jesus the other direction all the way back to Adam. If you've ever actually sat down and compared them side by side, you already know they don't match. Different names and different fathers listed for Joseph. Matthew organizes his in 3 neat sets of 14 generations, and he even skips several kings from the Old Testament record to make that pattern work cleanly. Skeptics often love to use this as a contradiction that they think proves the Bible isn't true, but that's not what's happening here at all. Matthew's writing to make a legal and a royal argument, tracing Jesus' right to David's throne through Joseph's line, structured for memorization in a Jewish context where sets of 14 would have carried weight. Luke is doing something else, tracing lineage all the way back to Adam to root Jesus in humanity's story from its very first covenant head. Same man, 2 genealogies, 2 very different theological arguments. So, even in the New Testament, right at the start of 2 of the 4 Gospels, we get proof that a biblical genealogy is a tool built for an argument, not a strict, unbroken chain of every single ancestor. So here's where that leaves us. In the Bible's own hands, a genealogy can track years, or it can track nations, or it can track culture, or it can track priesthood, or it can track kingship, or it can track covenant. The word genealogy tells you almost nothing about what you're going to get until you actually read what's on the page, which is why it's so sad when we all, honestly, I do it too, skip the genealogies from time to time. Which brings us right back to Genesis 5. If Genesis 10 is not handing us a chronology, and Genesis 4 isn't handing us a chronology, what if Genesis 5, sitting right there in between them, also isn't handing us a chronology? What if those carefully repeated ages are doing something that we haven't even really considered yet? If it's not handing us a chronology, what exactly are those ages doing? Let's look closer at the actual numbers, because once you start paying closer attention to the numbers, they get strange pretty quickly. Take the ages in Genesis 5 first as a set. Adam lives 930 years, Seth lives 912, Enosh, 905. Methuselah, the oldest of them all, 969. 30 numbers total across these 10 generations if you count both the age at fathering and the age at death for each patriarch. 30 numbers. Now, here's what scholars have noticed when they actually crunch these numbers. And before you ask, yes, they're the same in English and in Hebrew, but the Greek Septuagint is a different story, but I'll get to that in just a moment. Every single one of these ages gets broken down into multiples of 5 and 7, with sometimes 60 and its multiples thrown in as well. In the entire list, you'll never find a single one ending in 1, 3, 3, 4, 6, or 8. That's not what you'd expect from real recorded lifespans. Real ages are much messier. People often die at 73 or 81 or 46. These numbers are clean in a way that only makes sense if somebody built them that way on purpose. The key multiples of 5 and 7 aren't random numbers in the ancient world either. 5 and 7 are important. 7 shows up constantly in Scripture as the number of completion. It's a very famous one. It's the number tied to God finishing his work, and a lot of other times as well. 5 and its multiples, especially the multiple 60, come out of the ancient Near Eastern numbering system that the earliest audiences of Genesis would have definitely recognized. It's the same base 60 system that gave us 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle. When you write a genealogy using that framework, you're speaking in a language your audience already associates with order and completeness, and even cosmic significance related to the measure of time itself. Now, let me be really clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not doing numerology here. I'm not telling you that Methuselah's 969 years secretly decodes into hidden prophecy, or that if you multiply Enoch's age by the right constant, you get some mystical revelation. I'm very skeptical of that approach, and honestly, I think that you should be as well. What I am saying is a lot simpler than that. These numbers were clearly built, not simply recorded. And once you see that they're built, you have to ask yourself why. Not to discover some secret code, but to find out the purpose of the genealogy at a higher level. Even if we can't reconstruct every detail of that message 4,000 years later, we can look for purpose in the reasoning. Here's another piece of evidence that a lot of people have never heard. Grab a Bible that includes the Septuagint numbers, which are the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament. I told you I'd get back to this one. And compare it side by side with our standard Hebrew text. The ages don't match. In fact, a lot of people will say that the ages don't match because there's some great cover-up. I don't believe that at all. For most of the patriarchs, the Septuagint adds about 100 years onto the age when each one fathered his son. Adam is 130 in our Bibles, which is Masoretic Hebrew text when Seth is born. In the Septuagint, he's 230. Do that down the whole line, and the entire timeline from creation to the flood stretches out by nearly 600 years compared to what you're used to reading in most Old Testaments in English. Here's what I think that actually means. Again, I don't think it's a cover-up. If these numbers were meant to be locked in, unchangeable historical data based on actual lifespans, you wouldn't expect two ancient, faithful, careful manuscript traditions to disagree by 6 centuries. But if the numbers were always understood to be doing theological work first, encoding meaning rather than punching a clock, then it makes a lot more sense that different communities, translating and copying this text hundreds of years apart, felt free to render those numbers differently in translation without anyone accusing them of corrupting Scripture. Now, look at the names themselves for a second, set in a row. Adam means man, Seth means appointed, Enosh means mortal or frail, Kenan most likely means sorrow, Mahalalel means praise of God, Jared means descent, Enoch means dedicated or initiated. Methuselah's name is debated, but most scholars connect it to the phrase, when he dies, it will come, or man of spear or something like that. Lamech means powerful or strong, and Noah means rest or comfort. If you read that straight through, it's not just a list of names of relatives. It says something like, man is appointed and man is frail. Sorrow gives way to the praise of God. Then a descent happens. Someone dedicated walks with God and never dies. The death of the next one brings something significant, and then there's strength and finally rest. That's the outline of a story sitting in a family tree that we've been trained to skim past and put no significance into. So here's where that leaves us. We've got numbers built from sacred building blocks instead of an ordinary counting. We've got 2 ancient manuscript traditions disagreeing by 600 years without anybody panicking about it, for the most part. I mean, some people do, but they shouldn't. And we've got names that read like a sentence when you line them up. None of that looks like a chronology somebody wrote down to help you calculate a birthday. It looks like theology to me, which means we still haven't answered that first question, the real question. So let's answer that question. If these ages aren't marking years, what are they actually marking? To get there, we need to step back and look at the whole Bible. What is God doing throughout the rest of the story of Scripture? Because there's a pattern that shows up again and again, and once you see this pattern, you'll find puzzle pieces starting to fall into place all over Scripture that used to maybe be one of those puzzle pieces you have to kind of force in. At the highest level, the Bible is the story of God's relationship with humanity. The relationship is captured by a single word. That word is covenant. God doesn't relate to humanity as one big, undifferentiated crowd. He relates through covenant, and each covenant has a representative. One man stands in for many. And when that man is faithful, blessing flows to everyone in the covenant under him. When he fails, the consequence flows to everyone under him too. Theologians call this covenant headship or federal headship. Paul builds an entire argument on it in Romans chapter 5. He sets Adam and Christ side by side as two great covenant heads. Through one man's disobedience, sin entered the world, and death through sin. Through one man's obedience, many are made righteous. Paul is identifying both Adam and Jesus as covenantal representatives. He's pointing to a pattern. And honestly, once you notice this pattern, you start seeing it everywhere in Scripture. Look at the two halves of your own Bible that you have probably right there on the desk with you. Old Testament and New Testament. The Testament is just an old word for covenant. We don't call it the Old Timeline and the New Timeline as if the book is about chronology. The entire book itself is named after covenant, not chronology. From Genesis to Revelation, the story God is telling us is a story about who he binds himself to and how, generation after generation, through one representative after another. So, if the whole Bible is structured this way, it would be strange for it to start a different way. Genesis 1 tells you who made everything, and that it was good when he was done. Genesis 2 is where the covenant story begins, the one that the rest of the Bible is going to keep telling. In that light, Genesis 2 doesn't read like a second creation account competing with the first creation account. It reads like the establishment of a covenant itself, the first covenant, in fact. God places Adam in a garden that functions like a sanctuary. He gives him work to do that looks priestly. He's told to tend it and keep it, the same language that's used later for the Levites serving in the temple. He gives him one command, a law, a covenant stipulation, with a consequence attached to it for breaking it. It's all covenant language in Genesis chapter 2. And Adam isn't alone in this pattern. Noah gets a covenant with its own sign. Abraham gets a covenant with its own sign. Moses gets a covenant at Sinai. David gets a covenant promising an eternal throne. Each one is a federal head, marking a new stage in the same unfolding promise, all the way to Christ, the last Adam, as Paul puts him. In this story, Adam doesn't need a sign, of course, like the rainbow or the circumcision, because he walks with God every day, in person, every single morning. Which brings us back to Genesis 5. If genealogies elsewhere in the Bible track nations or culture or priesthood or kingship, and if the entire Bible is organized around covenant headship from Adam all the way to Christ, doesn't it seem strange to assume that this one genealogy, sitting right here at the start of that whole story, is suddenly just counting biological years instead? Every other genealogy we looked at was doing covenantal work or theological work. It would be strange if this one, the very first one, was the exception. So here's the reframe I want to offer you. What if the ages in Genesis 5 aren't marking how long each man's heart was beating, but how long each man's headship, his era of covenantal significance, lasted? Not a lifespan, but an epoch, a window of time during which that particular man represented God's covenant purposes for the people under him. The way Noah represents an epoch, and Abraham represents an epoch, and Moses represents an epoch after him. You can actually watch that headship role get more complex as the story goes on. Noah and Abraham are both building altars and making sacrifices as priests and as kings of their own family. At Sinai, it splits. Moses carries the covenant mediator role as a king figure, but the priestly function gets handed to Aaron and the Levites specifically. Then centuries later, under David, it splits even further. David and his line carry kingship exclusively, but the priesthood stays with a completely separate tribe altogether. The single figure who was once both priest and king, the way Adam was placed in the garden as both keeper and representative, gets divided into separate offices as history moves forward. We see that pattern maturing over time right up until Christ, who himself reunites the king and priest into one person again. Now, I want to be very careful here because I know where this can sound like it's heading. I'm not telling you Genesis 1 and 2 are metaphor or allegory or some kind of literary device that isn't really historical. They're not jumping between literary genres here. I don't think that's what's happening at all. I think both chapters are giving you real, literal history. Genesis 1 is the literal account of God ordering creation himself. Genesis 2 is the literal account of God establishing a covenant with a real historical man. Same reality, two registers, one universal and cosmic, and one covenantal in particular. That's exactly how the rest of the Bible operates too, by the way, telling the same story from different angles depending on what point is being made. So, when Genesis 5 hands you 10 names and 10 enormous numbers, and it calls it generations of Adam, I don't think it's accidental that that very same book gives you 3 other genealogies doing 3 other kinds of work. I think Genesis 5 is doing what the whole Bible does. It's telling you who carried the covenant forward and for how long, not how many candles were on anyone's birthday cake when they had a kid or when they died. So let's bring this all back together because I just gave you a lot of information. We started with a number most Christians grew up with, including me, 6,000 years. And we found out that that number isn't a direct quote in the scripture at all. It's built by chaining separate genealogies together and adding up ages as if every single one of them was trying to hand us a clock. But when you actually go look at how the genealogies work in the Bible, that assumption falls apart pretty fast. Genesis 10 tracks nations, Genesis 4 tracks culture, Chronicles tracks priesthood, where Samuel and Kings track kingship. And Genesis 5, sitting right there at the beginning of it all, gives you numbers built from sacred building blocks, numbers that shift by 600 years depending on which ancient manuscript you're reading, and names that read like a story when you line them up in a row. None of that looks like date setting or bookkeeping to me. It looks like theology. And once you place Genesis 5 inside the bigger pattern the whole Bible runs on, covenant headship, one man representing many, generation after generation, all the way to Christ, those ages stop looking like a countdown to Abraham. They start looking like a record of who carried God's covenant forward and for how long their era mattered. So, is this unfaithful to Scripture? I genuinely don't think so. I think it's actually taking Scripture more seriously, not less. We're not deciding in advance what the text has to say and then forcing it into that shape. We're asking what the text itself is doing, the same way we'd ask the question of Genesis 10 or Genesis 4 or Chronicles. And then we're following that answer wherever it may lead. This video is not telling you how old humanity actually is. If the genealogies aren't chronology, that leaves the real question wide open. How old is the earth and how old is humanity? Funny enough, that's exactly where I am going in my next video. Because once you stop asking these genealogies to be a stopwatch, an entirely different investigation opens. We can start looking for clues in the text and clues in the ancient history, and we can start lining them up like I like to do. We get to be detectives and archaeologists ourselves. We get to discover something. And that's just what we're going to do in the next one. So, I'll see you in a few days when the next video after this one comes out.